We are going to begin this deep dive with with an instant lesson in humility. I want you, the listener, to try something right now. Think about the last time you had to proofread something really important, a contract, a presentation, maybe just a critical email. If I showed you a short, simple phrase like, say, the best way to see the stars, and it had a repeated word in it like the or a, are you confident you'd spot it immediately, without fail?
Most people, yeah, their confidence is extremely high. They're certain, they feel like they know what they read.
Hmm.
And yet, the research shows that when you present these phrases quickly, people miss those repeated words with just stunning regularity. So the vast majority of people will confidently tell you they read the best way to see the stars when the text actually said the best way to see the stars.
And that right there, that counterintuitive fact that we so often fail to see what is definitively physically right in front of our faces, that's the foundation for our entire deep dive today. We don't see what's actually there, we see what our brain expects to be there.
Exactly. Your experience of reality, it's not a direct, high-fidelity mirror of the world around you. What we perceive is more like a constantly constructed, personal mental movie. And it's built not just from raw input, but through this continuous process of interpretation, of expectation, and prediction. It's lightning fast, and it happens almost entirely outside of your conscious awareness. It's an act of editing.
Okay, so let's unpack this phenomenal movie-making machine in our heads. Our mission today is to really understand the technical side of how the brain builds this deeply personal constructed reality. We need to distinguish between, the raw data and the final edited script. And most importantly, we're going to explore what happens when we realize we can actually edit that script, the absolute necessity of psychological flexibility, or what we call the power of reframing. So to understand the edit, we have to start with the raw footage. We need to establish this crucial distinction that psychology makes between sensation and perception. They sound like they could be the same thing, but they are radically different points in the whole process.
Sensation is just the objective, raw data. It's purely physical. Think of it like light waves striking your retina or sound waves vibrating your eardrum, pressure on your skin. It's just the energy stimulating your sensory receptors and traveling up your nervous system. If you had a brain with absolutely zero prior experience, that's all you'd get. Just a flood of data.
A chaos of data, really. Perception, then, is where the magic and all the construction happens. It's the brain's active, organized attempt to interpret that raw input, to categorize it, and finally, to give it meaning.
Yes, that's the movie part. It's the realization that those light waves form the shape of a coffee mug, or that those sound waves actually form the word hello.
And this organizing process, this filtering, it's essential, right? Because the world is just throwing a paralyzing amount of sensory information at us all the time.
Absolutely overwhelming. Your brain has to be ruthless. It has to prioritize and filter. And this begins with what we call bottom-up processing, the stream of information moving from the senses upward to the higher centers of the brain.
And that prioritization leads to a key concept: selective attention. We can only attend to a tiny fraction of all the stimuli coming at us, so we actively ignore almost all of it. It's a critical survival mechanism. You can't process every single leaf rustle, but the side effects are truly mind-bending.
Oh, for sure. The most famous example is, of course, the selective attention test. Viewers are asked to do something mundane, like count how many times a basketball is passed between players in a video. And if you concentrate hard enough on that counting task, your brain's filters decide everything else is irrelevant, and you can completely, totally miss a significant dramatic event.
Like a person walking into the center of the frame wearing a full gorilla suit.
Exactly, the gorilla.
That's the part that always gets me. My senses, my eyes, they registered the light waves of the gorilla, the data was there. But because my brain had decided the gorilla had zero relevance to the task of counting passes, the perception just never registered.
Right. The information was filtered out before it ever became real to you. You didn't fail to see the gorilla. Your brain actively chose not to let you see it. But that filtering, that bottom-up stream of data, that's only half the story. Perception doesn't rely solely on the data coming in. In fact, I'd argue most of the time, our brain is relying on what it already knows. And that brings us to top-down processing.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. Because top-down processing is where your expectations, your memories, your deeply ingrained prior knowledge, it all actively influences and can even override the raw sensory input. It means we don't just interpret data, we actively predict it.
We see this so clearly in that classic playing card experiment. Participants were shown playing cards for just a fraction of a second, but the colors were intentionally reversed, so like a red spade on a black background. Because the exposure time was so short, their brains had to fall back on expectation. It just filled in what it was confident it should see. So they would genuinely report seeing a black spade because their brain's top-down expectation just completely overruled the bottom-up signal.
So the brain isn't just filtering out what's irrelevant, it's actively substituting data based on its own internal model. This sounds an awful lot like the mechanism behind confirmation bias, doesn't it? If the incoming data is just close enough to what I already believe, my brain just defaults to efficiency and stamps the belief as true.
Absolutely. And neuroscience has a great name for this efficiency: predictive coding. The brain is constantly, furiously making predictions about what it expects to see, hear, or feel. It's using all of its past experience to build this working model of the world. And it's only when the sensory input deviates significantly from that expectation, when a prediction error occurs. Only then is the brain forced to stop and update its model.
It's that prediction error, that's the moment of learning. It's the friction that makes any kind of growth possible. If the error isn't strong enough, the brain just smooths it over, like with the repeated the.
Precisely. And to make this really tangible, we all have a permanent physical example of this happening in our vision right now: the blind spot. In each eye, there's a section where the optic nerve leaves, which means there are no photoreceptors. We literally cannot see anything in that spot. It is a hole in our vision.
But you never notice it. You don't walk around with a gaping black hole in your visual field.
And that's predictive coding at its most masterful.
Yeah.
The brain literally fills in that missing information. It just paints in whatever it expects to be there: the color, the texture, the pattern. It hides the gaps so seamlessly that you have zero conscious awareness of it. It prioritizes a smooth, efficient reality over a perfectly accurate one.
So if my brain is capable of hiding a giant physical blind spot for me every second of every day, just for the sake of smoothness and efficiency, it really raises an important question. What deeply ingrained truths or critical insights might I be habitually predicting away in my career or in my relationships just because they contradict the internal model I rely on?
That is the right question to be asking. And just to briefly close the loop on the neurology here, all this perception, this reality construction, it isn't stored in one movie file somewhere. It's created by distributed processing, these vast networks of neurons all working together. Perception is emergent. And that's why shifting a deeply ingrained way of seeing the world is so hard. You're not just changing one file, you're trying to reorganize fundamental neural networks.
So if the brain is built to fill in blind spots and smooth over reality based on prediction, it seems natural that it would scale that process up. We move from these immediate neurological predictions to the much larger concept of frames of reference or paradigms.
Right. A frame is that overarching mental structure we use to interpret entire complex experiences. And these frames are incredibly useful. They're the ultimate cognitive shortcut. They let us categorize, prioritize, and make sense of complicated situations instantly without having to calculate every variable from scratch.
But, just like with the blind spot, the utility of a shortcut often comes at the cost of flexibility. The rigidity of a fixed frame can become a kind of cognitive straitjacket.
Think about a classic, really relatable scenario. You get a terse two-line email from your boss. Instantly, your brain might slap a frame on it. Threat: I've made a mistake, or they're unhappy with my performance. And that frame immediately shifts your thoughts. I'm inadequate. Your emotions, your anxiety spikes, and your behaviors. You might get defensive or withdraw.
And you spend an hour just worrying, building a whole story around this threat frame. Then your boss just casually walks by and says, "Hey, sorry about that email. I was running late and hit send too fast." The message was totally neutral.
The situation itself, the text of the email, didn't change at all. What changed was your frame. And the second the frame shifted from threat to harmless logistical note, your physiological and emotional reactions just evaporated. That shows you the immense power of the frame in constructing your psychological reality.
And these frames, they're not just created overnight. They get shaped by our culture, our family, our education, our repeated professional experiences. And the more successfully we use a frame, the more it's kept us safe or made us efficient in the past, the more fixed it becomes.
Yeah.
And the harder it is to even recognize when it's starting to fail us.
Yeah, and this challenge of shifting fundamental perspectives, it's not just a personal psychological struggle, it's the engine of human progress. Thomas Kuhn, he popularized this idea of the scientific paradigm shift. He argued that real scientific revolutions don't happen through tiny adjustments. They happen when the entire intellectual community is forced to adopt a new foundational frame.
And the shifts are never easy. The old guard, the people whose entire careers and identities were built on the old framework, they resist fiercely. It's a painful process.
Oh, absolutely. Consider the huge historical shifts,
Hmm.
moving from an Earth-centered universe to a sun-centered one. That required people to fundamentally reject what their own senses told them. Or the acceptance of germ theory, which required medicine to reframe disease as an attack by external microbes, not some internal imbalance of humors. These weren't just new data points, they were complete overhauls of the operating manual.
And what's interesting in psychology is that our paradigms rarely disappear entirely. The field seems to expand and integrate them. We went from Freud's focus on the unconscious to behaviorism and external actions to humanism and potential, and now to cognitive behavioral models focusing on our thought processes. Each shift didn't really destroy the last one, it just provided a richer, more comprehensive frame for understanding what makes us tick. And that brings us to the crucial application of all this. How do we use this awareness of frames and paradigms to deliberately increase our own effectiveness and our well-being? This is really the heart of what the movement known as positive psychology provides.
For decades, traditional psychology, for very understandable reasons, focused heavily on pathology, on illness, on trauma, on what was broken. Positive psychology emerged to actively balance that view by rigorously studying human strengths, well-being, and what optimal functioning actually looks like.
Martin Seligman, one of the key founders, he essentially reframed mental health itself. The idea isn't just the absence of illness. The goal shifted from simply reducing suffering to actively promoting flourishing. And that requires a proactive shift in your frame, from deficit to potential.
And that concept of flourishing is captured so well in the PERMA model. It's not just a checklist. It's a whole framework built on understanding the core components of optimal effectiveness in life, personally, professionally, and in our relationships.
So let's quickly walk through what that frame includes. P is for positive emotions, not being happy all the time, but optimizing that ratio of positive to negative. E is for engagement, finding that state of flow in what you do. R is for relationships, authentic connection. M is for meaning, serving something larger than yourself. And A is for accomplishment, that sense of mastery.
Critically, all 5 of those elements of PERMA are supported by one foundational psychological tool: the deliberate act of reframing. Reframing is simply changing the perspective you apply to an event to reinterpret it. It's what you do when you move a failure from the frame of "this proves I am inadequate" to the frame of "this is high-quality data that shows me exactly what not to do next time."
That distinction from a fixed statement about your identity to just actionable data, that's profound. It immediately reduces the distress and massively enhances your effectiveness going forward. Think about the specific tools we use for reframing. Take humor. Humor is a powerful mechanism for shifting emotional responses. If you can use constructive, self-directed humor about a professional mistake, calling it your billion-dollar blunder learning opportunity, you have instantly reframed that mistake. It goes from being an identity-level disaster to a high-cost but invaluable lesson.
And it is so important to stress that distinction the source material makes about constructive humor. It's about building. Hostile humor that just tears people down. It's often just a defense mechanism, not a true cognitive reframe.
Right. And if humor is a powerful reframe, compassion might be the ultimate cognitive shift. Compassion functions as a reframe because it absolutely requires you to step out of your own internal perspective and, just for a moment, adopt someone else's frame of reference.
And that's the challenge, isn't it? It demands that you loosen your rigid, self-protective frame of "I am right and they are wrong," and instead ask, why does their constructed reality make them feel and act this way? Precisely. And by forcing that perspective shift, compassion naturally diffuses conflict and increases understanding. Both humor and compassion require the courage to recognize that your current frame is just one possible interpretation, and that you have the psychological flexibility to choose a more effective one.
So let's tie this entire deep dive together for you. We started with the humble observation that your brain will skip words and hide gorillas from you just to run more efficiently. We traced that neurological efficiency through predictive coding and the physical blind spot in your own eye. And we showed how that exact same process scales up into the fixed frames of reference that dictate your emotional responses and your professional effectiveness.
The way you see the world is literally a highly efficient construct. And learning to question your perception, to recognize that your brain is constantly making predictions and filling in the gaps, and then deliberately choosing to shift your interpretative frames, that is the foundational work of resilience and psychological effectiveness.
And the reason we aren't just stuck in that initial frame, the reason we can edit the script and build new perceptions is thanks to the brain's own secret superpower: neuroplasticity. The brain is capable of changing its own structure and function based on new experiences and intentional learning. You are not locked into the neural networks built in your past.
And that knowledge is incredibly liberating. It means your mental movie is fundamentally editable. You can intentionally create new, more robust neural pathways just by practicing new frames of reference.
So before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to consider based on everything we've talked about today. If your brain constantly fills in your blind spot and smooths over reality just to keep things feeling predictable, what essential truth or difficult insight might you be habitually predicting away right now in your professional or personal life? A crucial piece of data that you're missing simply because it fiercely contradicts a frame that has become too comfortable and too fixed. Go find that cognitive blind spot.